As I mentioned, I now edit a quarterly journal for the University of California Press. It's called Boom, a Journal of California. It's a journal, as I see it, a journal of California in the world, in conversation with the world. We're doing a special issue this fall focused around the 100th anniversary of the Los Angeles Aqueduct, which is a very seminal engineering project 100 years ago that brought water from Owens Valley in the eastern Sierra down to Los Angeles to create the great metropolis that we know, and particularly to create the San Fernando Valley. And so we're using that as a way of looking at the past, present, and future of water through culture, politics, history, art. And so we had an open page in the journal and offered it to UCLA that they could use as an ad because they generously host the journal and provide me with graduate students to work with and all. And so this is the ad that they came up with. And this is the revised version of the ad. Can anybody guess what word was missing from the ad when they first sent it to me? Exactly. So I had to go back to them and say, hey, humanities. You know, so if we're thinking about the environment and water and clean water and health, you know, we can think about, you know, science, engineering, law, public policy, and social science. It didn't even occur to them, you know, the humanities. Well, this is a deeply humanistic journal. Although they brought 3 of us from Stanford to help create the environmental humanities. You know, so I went back and said, you know, and they said, why? This is at, you know, the highest level of sort of communications in the university. And luckily, you know, then one of them, who's an ally, was on the email chain, actually said, do you mind if I send this to the Dean of Humanities and just tell him that you've been putting up the good fight? And I was like, no, that'd be fine, you know. So I just put this up to say that, like, as our charge was to talk about this strong model. You know, there's lots of times when it doesn't feel very strong. You know, we're still fighting. Right? I mean, it's the good fight, and we're also doing the work that we, you know, enjoy, and you know, our research. But you know, bringing the humanities into these, you know, truly interdisciplinary conversations with, you know, even in a place where, you know, we were, you know, explicitly brought to be a bridge, you know, at UCLA between what is, you know, North Campus and South Campus. North Campus is humanities and social sciences. South Campus is, you know, engineering and the natural sciences and medicine. You know, even then it's a kind of constant, you know, conversation and struggle, and I would remind them, you know, when you get these strategic visions and you say, hey, there's some things missing from this strategic vision, you know, that you're already investing in. And so, you know, in part in our, you know, in our conversation, I mean, my question about this was like, what are your goals? You know, what do you want this to do? And and it may be, you know, forming a community, recognizing a community, facilitating collaboration. Or, there's lots of things it could do, but I mean, another legitimate answer might be one is, you know, because we got a grant to do it. And, you know, we've got to produce something good for it so that we get other grants. I'm not, you know, some of us might scoff at that as a reason, but it's an important reason. Another one might be, you know, to show the deans what we're doing so that they understand it. And they can begin to tell the story of what we're doing. You know, we have great support from the Dean of Humanities. We have, you know, pretty good support from the Dean, you know, the Dean of Social Sciences, who, you know, understands, you know, what we're doing. But I think, though, you know, that is a legitimate, important part of, I think, what we're doing and need to communicate over and over again. stepping back to my point of view from, that those curves that I showed at the beginning, a lot of what the bigger picture of what we're engaged in is, that people understand there are tremendous environmental and human challenges, and that the environmental humanities, I think, arises in that crisis, in those crises, as well as in something, some kind, whether it's a crisis of soul searching or ongoing soul searching about what do the humanities have to contribute, to add. And I think it is in the environmental humanities gives us a really important strength, a strategic strength right now in relationship to the environment and in relationship to the humanities to articulate that. At a time, at least, where we are, I think where we see around the world, I'm just saying, I think, in the last 5 years, I wouldn't be surprised if there are now, dozens of environmental humanities programs, centers, institutes that have arisen around the world. And in ours, at UCLA, they don't necessarily know what it is, but they think it's important. That's a moment, to take advantage of. And the deans, think that this is going to be an important part of what's the future of the humanities in the 21st century. And so that's an opportunity for us. And I just want to say that I think it's not. It's not unimportant. It's important to be aware of that strategic situation, where we are and how it can help. Everything that we do, the research, the scholarship, pedagogy, public engagement, being aware of that strategic situation. That might be part of the calculus of what it is that you want to do.
Can I ask you a question that's specific to that, or is it better to? So part of our discussion on interdisciplinary, I know I try to figure it out, was, with that very point, strategically, are we better to think of this constellation of activities as just continuing in a somewhat, in the current, amorphous state? Is it to think of a federation that's a bit more strategically aligned, but that's not necessarily monolithically interdisciplinary? Or is it thinking really, hard about how how we could maybe even hypothetically all work together? Because part of the conversation was, when is interdisciplinary maybe too interdisciplinary? When is it too broad? When do you lose sort of the interesting edges for the benefit of finding common ground? If we were trying to define a mandate for a broad group like this, there would be compromises, and that would be good and that would be bad. So I'm just curious, especially on the heels of what you just said, if you have a sense of whether it's best to, your thoughts.
I guess I think those are good, important questions to keep asking. And I don't know enough about the Canadian situation and models and funding and relationships between universities, or even like how the deanery works within, if there are different ways the administration, kind of works, or the culture of it in Canadian versus American universities. For instance, in Australia, lots of times very different. But my sense, I guess, from what I see that we're doing is, in a sense, trying to do. So we're, with the environmental humanities now, to be part of a larger conversation and to fill what we perceived as a niche that might be useful for that global community. And it's an experiment. I didn't say this at the beginning, but I should add it as an experiment. It's a low-cost experiment. If it fails, okay, it wasn't the community didn't need it, and that's okay. That we have a grant from the Mellon Foundation to run a Sawyer seminar exploring this field, the emergence of the humanities and the environmental humanities and its impacts, and to try to figure out what are the main themes and what are the main issues that are driving the emergence of this field. So that's at the big level, and we'll be inviting people from all over the world to come and talk and be part of it, and to put together a volume for Rutledge, a companion to environmental humanities, that will address that big level. But then I think it's also really important, and we're frankly, trying to figure out, after having been at UCLA for a year, where is it? And we think that there's some, it's kind of ongoing slog. We think there's some really productive areas in the area of nature in the metropolitan area, and different cultural, understandings of nature within a bigger interdisciplinary project. But that, I think, is then, yes, to have like really specific projects that are advancing really important research questions that are important to us, that are important to the biologist, that are important to the engineer, whoever that is. I think it's important to have those two things going on right now, but it's really important also to have those very specific things here that are interdisciplinary, may, if they get too big, be too important, so they have to be really focused on research questions.
I think the model that, I think this is a really good question, the model that is a little bit of an alarm signal from the past in my head is the model of cultural studies, which was a very interdisciplinary area held together by nothing but politics. So there was a shared politics, but theoretical assumptions and anti-theoretical assumptions were all wildly mixed in with each other. And I think that's in the end what made fizzle out as a cutting edge kind of interdisciplinary area, because it wasn't actually any coherence. And I think that's a little bit where the promise of maybe also the danger, I'll talk about that in a minute, but also the promise of the digital humanities is that they actually, by bringing that in and generating humanities scholarship that is differently informed than usual humanities scholarship, at least some of what we do could carry beyond that. Because, environmental and environmentalism means almost nothing these days, except, there's a broadly understood political project, but within that, there are now so many different positions that I think it's really, that's a really good question, when we bring all that together. Do you have something that in the end is not intellectually very interesting anymore? But I think that's where we're at, and I mean, that's the other thing I think to say also about environmental humanities, let alone digital environmental humanities. I think to me that's mostly an aspirational term right now. I don't actually see environmental humanists all together in a room all too often. Mostly it's literary scholars and historians seem to go to each other's conferences a fair amount in the US. In Australia, it seems like the literary scholars and the philosophers work a fair amount with each other. Here, I think the philosophers are totally out there. I mean, they don't have to, I'm seeing sorry. I don't know how often you see like TED Talk or whatever, and any other. So I think that there's some real work to do, right? And actually bringing us together, and so I think part of the institutional work is figuring out what our questions are and what the digital might have to contribute. I mean, two things sort of occur to me in response to sort of Stephanie's request to think about institutionalization, and one is this institutionalization of the environmental humanities as some kind of shared area within the humanities. And that in and of itself is not easy to do. I think what we have on our side and what I see is that there's various other digital humanities, medical humanities, public humanities, whatever that is. I mean, there's these other humanities nominated fields that are also emerging at the same time. It seems to me they all come out of a similar impulse, which is that humanities departments at a lot of institutions are under financial pressure. And it's becoming slowly clearer that we're probably not going to be able to justify our existence in the future anymore if we just sort of present to deans series of unconnected, very specific, very individualized research projects. That's going to look interesting and curious, but it's going to be like that odd museum of Jurassic technology in LA, which just has a bunch of really, really cool and interesting and different artifacts in it, but it's not clear sort of what overall holds it together. I think there is a sense among a lot of humanities scholars that we do need a larger agenda. And we also need an agenda that is recognizable not just to youth, but to the public at large. And I think there's a real urge, especially on the part of activists or politically engaged scholars, to sort of make it clear what the humanities can contribute to field of life, environmental struggles. And again, that's going to be very difficult on the basis of like presenting, a revolutionary reading of Willa Cather or something. It's not going to be hinging on those very specific projects. It's going to hinge on that larger vision. So that's one aspect of the institutionalization, and I think that's not going to be easy, because I do think that we are often very mired in the specificity of our projects and very reluctant to acknowledge sort of larger things. The other question is how we institutionalize within the university. And I think for us, one reason we left Stanford was that we actually saw it as very difficult to institutionalize there. So their environmental humanities started out as the eco-criticism reading group in 2007, and it was at the time nothing more than just a group of 12 people and a pizza and a bottle of wine. And we alternated between meeting on campus in somebody's house up in San Francisco. There was a lot of grad students in San Francisco. And so then it gradually became a little bit bigger, and we managed to get funding from this and that. Not huge amounts, but to get $5,000 or $10,000 from somebody that buys you pizza and photocopies and a bottle of wine for a whole year, right? And it doesn't take much money. And so then it gradually became, we got a little more money, we could invite speakers and so forth. And so then it at some point migrated over into the environmental humanities project, because we wanted to make it more than just lit scholars. But so we did that since 2007 or something. So yeah, five or 6 years, 2006 even. Yeah, it was like 6 years. But then we also sort of hit the boundaries of that, and those were the boundaries of a private university where the number of students in the humanities and the number of faculty is relatively limited, which doesn't concern you if you do a really major established field, but if you're in an emergent field, that turned out to be problematic. In the English department at Stanford, there's nobody else doing eco-criticism. So nobody could really write a dissertation. There were no people there for dissertation committee, right? Some people had to always work with people who weren't really in the field, or they had to try to work with Richard White in history, but he was also sort of the only figure left standing there. And Stanford has never really been cluster hiring. I think in these new areas, you're totally dependent on cluster hires. Otherwise, it's just not going to work. Or you have the critical mass, and that was one of the things that attracted us. UCLA in the English department, they were already in this degree in Ralph Watson, the different fields who were already doing it, and they were hiring 3 of us, John in history, Alison Ruth, and myself in English. So in English, we're now 4 who are specifically doing eco-criticism. In history, how many are there? A few. It's still not where it should be, but you have a core. And then there's Stanford didn't have a geography department. UCLA does, and there's a lot of cultural geographers that do stuff there. Judith Carney, Susanna Heck, and others. So there's a field, and that's actually sort of the interesting thing about the environmental humanities, is that to the extent that you're never going to have more than a few people in your own department doing that, you actually, you kind of need that community of other people. And so there's a couple of different sort of models for institutionalization that we're currently looking at, or that I have sort of in the back of my head. One is just, what you, I guess, in the first stage always try to do. You teach classes that deal with this new material, and you try to make it, especially at the graduate level, but also at the undergraduate level, you try to make it as interdisciplinary as you can, so other people, people from other departments, students from other majors also see it, and if possible, team teach classes, although I have to say my experience with team teaching has been a little bit mixed, and there's often, at many universities, there are difficulties with who gets the credit for it and stuff like that. But you can very successfully invite other people from the university to give 1 or 2 lectures in your class, and that creates an at least sort of seminal interdisciplinarity. And then sort of once you start trying to think from there, well, how can you really make environmental environmental humanities a recognizable entity, I mean, it seems like we're looking at two different possibilities right now. There is an environmental studies program there and an undergraduate major. So environmental humanities could become a track or a component, and those are, again, two different, slightly different models within that. And that, you know, that would be a good possibility. I'm not sure. I mean, it really depends. I mean, I know from a lot of people who have tried to do that the humanities do remain sort of on the back burner in environmental studies programs, that yes, technically the students have to take a few classes, but really what they do is science. Yeah, mostly biology majors with a sense for the social or something, right? So there's something. No, then the other thing, I mean, and this is, we just heard this recently, and I don't know how firm the plans are, but we heard that perhaps our humanities dean wants to be, I mean, he is very interested in creating things that will reach across the humanities, because the deans also are a little unhappy with the fragmentation, especially in literary studies. The problem is that you have departments of English, which are relatively big, but then you have French and Italian and Spanish and Middle Eastern and East Asian departments that are usually super small but costly. So they're looking for ways intellectually but also, you know, administratively to bring people together. And so it seems that there might be an initiative afoot to create an undergraduate humanities major that would have 4 or 5 different tracks. So medical humanities might be one, digital humanities almost certainly will be one, urban humanities, which is sort of an emerging field, will be one, and environmental humanities, if this comes about, will certainly be one. So that would be, I think that would be an interesting way of institutionalizing, because that would be a humanities major. So these kids would be humanities-oriented students. But, you know, they would take an array of classes that would be really different from the ones that you would get in the English department or history department. So I think that would be kind of an interesting thing to see. At the same time, we're dealing with other questions of institutionalization at a higher level. We have an institute, as we did at Stanford. There was a Roots Institute there. The institute at UCLA, there's a part of the faculty in it who would like to convert it into a school because it would be more visible, it would bring in more funds, they would have their own lines and so forth. I sort of quake a little bit in my pajamas at that idea, because my experience with schools has always been that school boundaries are even harder to leap over than departmental boundaries. And so I can't see a school of environmental studies at UCLA that would have a really dominant humanities presence, but maybe I'm wrong about this, we'll have to see. But there is a real, I mean, to me there's sort of, I mean, in the sort of last 7 or 8 years of doing this, so I guess my bottom line on institutionalization is that you want some of it, but I'm actually not sure how much of it you want. And I ran the Modern Thought and Literature program at Stanford, which is a really small graduate program. And a lot of people were afraid that was going to be axed during the recession. And Stanford did close down under great pains and under a lot of protest, one other program that was actually only faculty over 70 were involved in it. So as a dean, you look at that and go, maybe that is a program to shut down. But it's, so I had long discussions with deans about this, because I wanted to make sure that NPL wouldn't get shut down. It didn't get shut down. But the problem is this, that this is not just deans. I think this is a problem for all of us. The problem is that as you institutionalize, you get more visibility, you get in some ways more security for the future, you maybe get better access to funds. The downside is, and this is sort of what the deans told me in the case of this program, they said, well, you know, it's always like, okay, a certain disciplinary moment, faculty are really excited about a certain issue or topic, and they want a center, you know, and so the university fundraises for the center, a center gets established, administrator gets hired, funds for students get raised, you recruit graduate students, and then after 10 years, you know, the faculty who started it are perhaps no longer that interested in this particular issue or field, or they've taken offers elsewhere, they're gone. The university is still stuck having to run that shop. They still have to pay the administrator, they still have to raise their student funds, they still have to give somebody course release for running it, and so on and so forth. So they've become very reluctant, even a place like Stanford, they're very reluctant about creating new centers. And to some extent, extent, I agree with this, and I think that's also true of professional organizations. I mean, ASME has sort of spawned these sister organizations around the world. And on one hand, I think that's awesome. You know, the people who've been instrumental in that are only to be admired because they've often done it under very, very complicated circumstances. Imagine trying to found an organization for the study of literature and the environment in China, for example. That one doesn't exist yet for good reason. There's great official suspicion of that enterprise. On the other hand, I then often find that with these professional organizations too, you then have to expend so much time and energy and effort running the organization that nobody has time to write papers anymore or do any research, right? And so there's always, I mean, the more you institutionalize it, the more you then have to put, you know, part of it, and we all know this, I mean, you then have to put your creative energy into keeping the institution rolling. I think that's a real, and I sometimes, in the last few years at Stanford, I found myself wishing myself back to the early days when it was just 10 people in a room with a bottle of wine and a really good eco-trip book, right? Because there was no fuss, no muss. We could jump right into the, whereas if you have speakers and you have to have somebody who makes the claim, right? I mean, you end up investing in an awful lot of collective, individual and collective energy and just keeping stuff rolling. So I wouldn't, I think we need visibility, but there's a trade-off. And so I think that's why I kind of like these portals, because they're actually a way of, these portals too are a pain in the neck, because you design something, you surround it, something needs to update it. I mean, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. So maybe I'm with the curmudgeons on it. There's a lot on that. But on the other hand, I mean, websites and the internet are actually a good alternative way of creating communities without institutionalizing in the usual way. So that will be sort of my silver lining there.
Great. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions for John or Ursula?
Jane and I are in an interdisciplinary school environment. I'm just curious, what happens from the top down besides lines? I mean, what do you go after in terms of university administration support to maintain these programs?
I think some people may have heard live, but you said lines, right?
Yeah.
So I think it would be, we'd love to probably pick your brain about what it's like to be in an interdisciplinary school, because, I mean, that's, as Ursula said, that's something they're considering. And there's a lot of resistance because of issues of territory, jurisdiction, lines, and whether that's actually going to increase interdisciplinarity or actually make it more difficult. The Institute is a kind of, the Institute of Environment Sustainability, among which there is some movement to, at this point it's not, it's kind of, we can't actually say to create a school, to investigate whether creating a school is a good idea or not, is a kind of weird hybrid thing, that was created at a certain moment 12 years ago or something as, in a way, I mean, kind of maybe an incubator, if you will. I mean, kind of low cost, where it didn't have any lines. It was, it just had some guarantee of annual funding or some administration, but it was mostly a kind of place for collaboration, where people could come and it kind of grew organically and willy-nilly, and raised more money and some more staff, and then it recently faced the possibility that its ongoing funding from the university would end and it would be on its own. So they had to go back and fight for that ongoing funding. So there's some funding from the top down, but which was just about to go away, but has now been reinstituted for several years. But other than that, I mean, the Institute itself is sort of a, from the top down, it doesn't report to any department or school, so it reports right to a vice chancellor in the UC system. So it's an odd kind of thing, but and that they have not been realized out of this kind of more fuzzy institute. Is that?
I mean, I think the other thing, I mean, so you have to have admissions procedures, you have to have graduate students, you have to have ways of funding those graduate students, you have to have much more personnel, you have an admissions process and a fellowship administration process and all these things, you have to build curriculum. I mean, it's going to be a huge effort. So no, I mean, it would require enormous addition. And I mean, then there's a whole question of, okay, so then the school has its own line. So are the people who are in that school still appointed in their original departments or not? And for a biologist, it might not make any difference whether he or she is in a biology department or in a school for the environment. I sort of feel if my only appointment is in an environmental school, that's professional suicide. If I don't have any connection to in some kind of literature department anymore, you're kind of cut off. And I think that's true of a lot of people in the humanities. So the question is, how would that work? Would you then have these cross-appointment processes? How would classes come? I mean, there's just a whole, I mean, these things sound like they're trivial, but then they're not. We spend years trying to sort them out when we try to establish something like that. So it would be considerable. And I'm also, the other sort of more intellectual reservation that I have about it is that really our goal? The environment becomes its own area of research somewhere out here that competes with everybody else for resources. Wasn't the idea that the original environmentalist idea that no, the environmental question is actually everywhere. It's in questions of labor, questions of agriculture, questions of social justice, questions of public health, questions of wildlife conservation, right? I mean, wasn't that sort of the strength that we bring it into all of these disciplines that thought they had nothing to do with it? And to what extent do we lose precisely that no, I don't want to be in a school of the environment, just formulate the argument, not hypothetically, but no, maybe I don't want to be in a school of the environment because I want to transform how we do literary studies, and I want to show how that's important for literary studies. I can lose that if I separate myself off. So it would be that sort of environmentalism becoming its own special interest and its own area of expertise that doesn't really have to keep dialogue with everything else. And to some extent, I resist that. I think, no, actually, the environmental question is one that we have to bring back into the humanities, and that's why we have sometimes these sort of the environmental post-humanities, because in so many ways, the digital too does that. Actually, we're putting in question the primacy and the sort of unquestioned centrality of just the human, right? And that's sort of one of the challenges, and I think we lose that if we were out and around. But hey, ask me again in 2 months, I might think differently about it. But I mean, that's a little bit sort of just intellectually, regardless of, what it would take. So I don't know, how do you guys solve that?
The cynical answer is it's like $50 million or something. It's like if they get a $50 million,
They can do it.
we'll give it.
Well, half and half appointments, and it has its own challenges, but that one asks a really provocative question about how interdisciplinary they should be. And I think there's an argument that maybe it shouldn't be that interdisciplinary, the digital environmental humanities. Maybe you need to bring more things under the same intellectual thing, try to create an identity that's distinct from all the other fields, as opposed to having to be truly interdisciplinary.
Just maybe comment on my question. Thinking about this and working with a large interdisciplinary research group for a number of years, and the idea, the real problem of thinking about interdisciplinary as collapse, rather than a question of equity. And the idea that what makes me a good historian is actually understanding what makes you a good literary scholar. And that's something that I learned, that there are things that I need to get from a literary scholar that I just don't want to do. But at the same time, a literary scholar really wants to talk to a historian because they're an historian. And it's appreciating the question of equity. And it's sort of backing away from that to a more functional question. Institutionalization as something which is structural, which is real life, as it were, as a very active thing, or something institutionalization as a very interdisciplinary, as a very active thing that the individual does as a practice. And something that's sort of bubbling up out of these sort of points is the idea of a portal or a website as an aggregator that positions interdisciplinary in a very different kind of fundamental way, because it allows the preservation of an individual discipline on the one hand, but actually the meeting itself can be constructed if it's done intelligently and really, really thoughtfully as a way of mediating through aggregation. So that changes interdisciplinary, really positions it as a conversation, which is an entirely different thing. It's kind of, there is a middle point between these hard and fast institutional models that require certain kinds of funding and the practice of the individual that sees the interdisciplinary as collapsed. And this is one of the things that I think we find so fascinating about the digital is it gives us a new way of looking at mediation. That gives us different opportunities to think about it. So are you thinking about a portal or something in your own conversations that help you preserve your disciplinary identity while talking to one another?
Well, I hope that environmental humanities now do that. Again, just to say, I don't see it as, I don't want to, have it compete with what everybody else is doing. So we're actually not thinking of commissioning or creating original content, but just highlighting, surfacing, pointing to, sharing what's out there.
Maybe I was projecting that.
Yeah, put it into conversation with each other. But we want to, if there's wherever there's original content out there, to bring it, to try to help bring it into conversation and not compete with that.
That's not happening when you're doing it from outside. It's happening internally.
Internally within UCLA.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that we haven't done that yet. Probably we probably will have, because everybody has to have some kind of website. We will have a website that we'll create within, that will be what we're doing at UCLA, and that will be created in conjunction with this Balance Lawyer seminar that where we're looking at the emergence and impact of environmental humanities. And that's a really good suggestion. I hadn't really thought of it explicitly like that, but I think in some ways that's right. We're not necessarily saying that every environmental philosopher has to work with a historian or a literary scholar or a geographer, because all those curves, those conversations have all been emerging at the same time.
Yeah.
There is a value to having those, to understanding what the disciplinary conversations are, as well as what the interdisciplinary possibilities are. So I think, we're thinking about that explicitly, but the way you frame it, I think, is helpful for thinking about how to represent it.
I think on the thing, is done. Their insights, and I think there's definitely a conversation that can happen between people who are here from the School of the Environment and really discussions been around for. Renee, how long is it? 10, 15 years? The School of the Environment? 15.
About 15 years.
Yeah.
No, we'd be really curious, because that would also be really important insights to take back to the discussion on there. I don't know, what does it look like 15 years later?